into Sinai Peninsula and Israel and Lebanon and Assyria and Turkey, all the way into parts of India. So as you can see here in the 27th dynasty, it starts off with Pharaoh Cambyses. After that is Darius the First, Darius the Great, another name for him. And here we see Pharaoh Amhose the Second and his son Psamtik the Third. And these were Nubian pharaohs right here that you see. And these Nubian pharaohs were defeated by the Persians around 524 to 404 BC. Around 500 BC, they were defeated by the Persians. Most of what is known about the Nubians' reign in their life was documented by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BC. Herodotus, a Greek historian, states that the Nubian pharaoh Psamtik III had ruled Egypt for only 6 months before he was confronted by a Persian invasion of his country that was led by King Cambyses II of Persia. Cambyses would reign as the first Persian pharaoh of the 21st century as a result of his defeat of the Nubian pharaohs of Egypt. So in 525 BC, Cambyses the Persian defeated the Egyptian pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, and he ruled Egypt after that point. This took part during the reign of the Kushite king Amani Natake, and various historical records mention military frictions between Kush and Persia. Herodotus, the Greek historian, and he was also a geographer, he reported that Cambyses wanted to conquer Kush, so he sent to the king of Kush spies as messengers bearing gifts. The king of Kush, as Herodotus explains, was aware of the fact that the Persian messengers were in fact spies. However, the king of Nubia made a ridicule of Cambyses' gifts, and he further insulted him by sending him a bow back with the messengers telling him that when the Persians draw their bows of equal size as mine, as easily as I do this, then he, Cambyses, shall march against the long-lived Ethiopians. This is in Herodotus' book. According to Herodotus, Kush did not pay tribute to Persia, but instead they constantly sent the Persian kings precious gifts, including gold, ebony, and elephant tusks. We also know from Herodotus, as well as from other Greek reporters, that part of the Persian army of King Xerxes was composed of Kushite archers as well. Here we see pictures of the pharaohs of the 27th dynasty, which was Persian, and then we see a picture of the pharaoh of the 30th dynasty, which happened to be a non-Persian dynasty at that time. So the Persian king Cyprus was the father of the first Persian pharaoh of the Egyptian 27th dynasty. The Persians ruled all the way to the 31st dynasty for the most part, and below is the head bust of the 31st dynasty pharaoh. The Persians and the Elamites, the royal guards, the warriors, the palace of Susa, or Shushan, which is in the book of Daniel. They're also called the 10,000 Immortals because they always had 10,000 men on standby to fight any countries that they had to fight. So from 330 to 323 BC, the Greek ruler Alexander the Third, aka Alexander the Great, conquered Egypt, Persia, Macedonia, and Asia Minor. Asia Minor is like Turkey, Armenia, making him ruler over the vast area of land. In 334 BC, he invaded the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Alexander the Great broke the power of Persia in a series of decisive battles. Most notable battles was the Battle of Issus and Gaugamela. He subsequently overthrew the Persian king Darius the Third, and he conquered the Achaemenid, which is the Persian Empire in its entirety. At this point, Alexander the Great's empire stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. Now, the Seleucid Empire, we always might a lot of times hear that name, but the Seleucid Empire was also a Greek empire. So after the death of Alexander the Great of Macedonia in 323 BC, the territories he had conquered were divided between his Greek generals, the so-called Diadochi, And it's the note that the wars of the Diadochi marked the beginning of the Hellenistic period and the infusion of Greek into Judaism. Alexander the Great had a friend. His friend was named Seleucus Nicator. He lived from 312 to 280 BC, and this guy became the king of the eastern provinces of the Greek Alexander the Great, approximately modern-day Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, together with parts of Turkey, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. His kingdom would be called the Seleucid Empire, and this huge kingdom had two capitals, which Seleucus founded in around 300 BC, Antioch in Syria, and Seleucia in Mesopotamia, Iraq. Seleucus established a dynasty that lasted for 2 centuries, during which time Hellenistic art and a fusion of Greek and Near Eastern artistic traditions developed and flourished. They also infused Greek culture and religion and theology into Judaism culture and traditions. This is a bust head portrait sculpture of Seleucus Nicator. He was the last of the original Diadochi. The Diadochi successors was basically a name of the first generation of military and political leaders after the death of Macedonian king and conqueror Alexander the Great in 323 BC. So to settle the question whether his empire should disintegrate or survive as a unity, and if so, under whose rule, they fought in 4 full-scale wars. And these military leaders, they all fought against each other over the whole empire, and the result reached by 300 BC was a division into 3 large parts, which more or less coincided with Alexander's possession in Europe, Asia, and Egypt. Moving right along. So again, we have to reiterate that again during this time, as Flavius Josephus admitted, that everybody living in Judea that were called Jews were basically a people that basically embraced the religion of Judea, a religion of Judaism, and they were of other nations. And as we talked about before, the land of Simeon and the land of the territory of the tribe of Judah was in the southern part of Israel, right next to Edom, and where the ancient Amalekites were during the biblical times. So Yeshua knew that the Gentiles were in Judea. He said it in Matthew 10, verse 5. He says, then these 12 Jesus sent forth and commanded them, saying, go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. There's also a scripture where Yeshua, a lady that needed healing, a Canaanite woman, and at first Jesus kind of ignored her or didn't answer her, and he said that he was sent for the lost sheep of Israel. But then she had faith, and later Yeshua did heal her. This is in the Bible. So he knew during his time in the 1st century AD that the people living in Israel were Gentiles, and that the true children of Israel, descendants of the 12 tribes, were lost. He made a clear distinction here, and he said that to his disciples, do not go to the Gentiles in Judea and into any city of the Samaritans, which were in North Israel. So he knew that the people walking around Judea and the people walking around in Samaria were not of the house of Israel. He knew they were not Israelites, and that's why he said he wanted to find the lost sheep of Israel. If the sheep of Israel were all in their same territories, then they would be all in clear sight and clear view. He never made that statement. But instead, he made the statements: do not go into the way of the Gentiles and into the way of the Samaritans, because the Samaritans were known to have people that were also proselytes, especially since the Samaritan area of northern Israel was known in the past to be occupied by the people that the Assyrian king Sennacherib put in that place instead of the children of Israel back in 700 BC. And as you can see here, Samaria was in northern Israel, and Judea lower parts, and then you see Idumea, or the land of Edom, even lower than that. So the Seleucid Greek king Antiochus III, like I said before, the Maccabees arrived on the scene around 246 BC. The Seleucid Greeks, they lost substantial territory in the east as a nomadic group called the Parni settled in the satrapy, or the administrative district, or Parthia, in northern Iran. In the same period, the satrapy, or the district of Bactria, which was Afghanistan, they claimed independence from the rule of Seleucid the Greek. However, Seleucid king Antiochus III reconquered much of these areas back. He took back Afghanistan, he took back Iran, and he even campaigned his rule to stretch as far as east as the country of India. And in the west, the Seleucid King Antiochus, fought several wars with his fellow Macedonians in the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. The Egyptian forces were crushed again in 200 BC by the Seleucids, the Greeks, and the Ptolemy were forced to give up Palestine to another Greek, Mr. Antiochus, who was proclaimed the conqueror of the East. Most of the time at that period, many of the black Israelites were already scattered, and Islam was not even a religion yet. So this land was full of Gentiles, and there were no Muslims during that time. Hebrews, Israelites were gone out of the land of Judea. 196 BC, Antiochus III crossed the Hellespont, and 2 years later had added the region of Thrace. A lot of times we hear about Thrace in the movies, like in the movie 300, which is centered out of Greece. And actually, Thrace was the eastern tip of Greece, and Antiochus III added this area to his empire. So this brought the Seleucid Empire into direct contact with the dominant Mediterranean power of Rome. In 190 BC, the Roman soldiers for the first time set foot in Asia. In the following year, a Seleucid army of 75,000 met the Roman forces, who at the time only numbered 30,000 at the Battle of Magnesia. Despite the odds, Antiochus was completely defeated by the Romans, and the Seleucid Empire lost its possessions in Anatolia, Turkey. So this started to spell the end of the Seleucid Empire. So in 168 BC, the ruler of the Seleucid Greek kingdom, this time his name was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, he stepped up his campaign to squash Judaism so that all the subjects of his vast empire, which included the land of Israel, would share the same culture and worship the same God. So he was getting tired of Judaism, even though it was Hellenized, and he wanted to just basically have the people living in Judea worship Zeus and all the Greek gods and infuse their culture. And so he marched into Jerusalem, this new Greek ruler. He vandalized the temple, and he erected an idol on the altar and desecrated the holiness of this altar, even though it wasn't holy because it wasn't the temple and the holies of holies room with the Ark of the Covenant. And he erected an idol on the altar, and he desecrated it by using the blood of swine, decreeing that studying the Torah, observing the Sabbath, and circumcising the Jewish boys, the Jewish convert boys, were punishable by death. He sent Greek overseers and soldiers to the villages throughout Judea to enforce his laws and to force Jews to engage in idol worship. Now, when the Greek soldiers reached Modin, which is about 12 miles northwest of the capital, they demanded that the local Gentile Jewish leader, Mattathias, which was supposed to be of the Cohenite tribe, but he was actually a Greek Gentile member of the priestly class at the time. They wanted him to be an example to his people by sacrificing a pig on a portable pagan altar. Now, this man named Mattathias, he refused and killed not only the Hellenistic Jew who stepped forward to do the Greeks' bidding of this sacrificing a pig on the altar, but he also killed the Antiochus Epiphanes IV, his representative. So with the rallying cry, whoever is for God, follow me, that was the cry that he made. Mattathias and his 5 sons, Jonathan, Simon, Judah, Eliezer, and Johanan, fled to the hills and the caves of the wooded Judean wilderness, joined by a ragtag army of soldiers, an army of others like them, the simple farmers dedicated to the laws of Moses. They armed only themselves with spears, bows, and arrows, and rocks from the terrain. These Maccabean children, or Mattathias' sons, particularly Judah, who came to be known as the leader, they fought a guerrilla war against the well-trained, well-equipped, seemingly endless forces of the mercenary Greek army. And after 3 years, the Maccabeans cleared the way back to the Temple Mount, which they reclaimed. They cleaned the temple and dismantled the defiled altar and constructed a new one in its place. And 3 years to the day after Antiochus' mad rampage, the Maccabeans held a dedication of the temple, Hanukkah, with proper sacrifice, rekindling the golden menorah, and 8 days of celebration and praise to God. After that, proper Jewish worship, according to them, had been reestablished. This is all basically the storyline of the book of Maccabees, part of it. In the 2nd century BC, Judea had laid between 2 empires. It was basically taken over between the Ptolemaic kingdom based in Egypt and the Seleucid Empire based in Syria. So on each side of Judea, kind of sandwiched in between, was these Greek empires. Kingdoms formed after the death of Alexander the Great. The Greeks were also in Judea, but they were under the rulership of the Maccabees. So prior to this, Judea had been under the Ptolemaic rule, but fell to the Seleucids. And the Jews in Judea had already been affected by Hellenization, which begun under Alexander the Great. And some of the Jews, notably those of upper class, notably the Tobiad family, wished to dispense with Jewish law and to adopt a Greek lifestyle. And according to historian Victor Cherkover, the main motive for Tobias Hellenism was economic and political. The Hellenizing of Jews, they built gymnasiums in Jerusalem, which was a common thing for the Greeks. And they also competed in international Greek games, removed their marks, circumcision, and repudiated the Holy Covenant. The Jewish festival of Hanukkah celebrates the dedication of the temple that they put up after, the dedication of the temple following Judah Maccabees' victory of the Seleucids. So they were in the temple that Ezra had started to build, and this temple had not yet been destroyed yet, and it had not yet been modified by King Herod. So, as you can see here, the picture shows Hanukkah when it started, what it was from in 165 BC, and Hanukkah today, 1917, how they celebrate Hanukkah. So Mattathias, when he killed the Hellenistic Jew who stepped forward to offer sacrifice to an idol, he and his 5 sons fled to the wilderness. Afterwards, like I talked about, they was able to overcome the Greeks that were controlling the area, and they set up their own Maccabean dynasty. The Maccabeans destroyed all the pagan altars in the villages. They circumcised the boys that were there, and they forced Jews either to get back right and do the things that they wanted to do, or to be outlawed. And the term Maccabees, as used to describe the Jewish army, is taken from the Hebrew word for hammer. So the whitenization of the Bible in history is evident if you look at different movies and TV shows like the Bible series. If you look at Exodus, Gods and Kings, and the Noah movie, and the movie is coming out called Mary, and you look at the old 10 Commandments movie, You see that Jesus and Noah and the Egypts and Moses were all white, and this is basically whitenization of the Bible, and it's all false. And we'll see how this ended up happening, and how it's still happening today, and how we are still affected by it and still brainwashed to believe all the stuff that they've been showing us, and predictively programming stuff into our brain to believe things to be a way that they were really not back in the day. So have we been tricked to hate ourselves and to love the white man because of this, because of the history being changed and the whitenization of the Bible and the establishment or belief that we are cursed, or cursed with Canaan? Is this why we hate ourselves, or supposedly hate ourselves, and love the presence of the white man? The white man is most desired by most races. Asians and Latinos and Indians tend to do well and tend to love marrying into the white race, especially if the white man has a good job. So here we see here in 2012, these are all influential black men. They came up with the controversial film premiere in 2012 called Hoodwink, and they made note that there was more black men at one point in history in jail than actually in college. So we know that in the Bible, a lot of people will criticize and condemn the Bible by saying that it's a book that promotes slavery, because in the Peter chapter 2 verse 18 it says a good slave is a good Christian. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. However, in older versions of the Bible, like in the Greek versions of the Bible, and we don't know what the Hebrew Bible says, you would see the word servant or maidservant or manservant instead of the word slave. Now, whether a slave and a servant are two different things, sometimes the servant has a little bit more rights and is treated different than a slave. Just like you have a butler and you have a nanny, and you have people that work under you that are kind of like servants or assistants, and they do everything for you, but they're not cruelly punished and abused like as you would see with a slave that has like basically no rights. It's basically property of the other person. But of course, over time, the white man, a European man, has his way of changing the words in the book of the Bible to see fit to his agenda, even if it means changing the word servant or maid servant, like Abraham had maid servants, and he actually had children with one of his maid servants, into the word slave. So here we can see here is a picture of the Catholics holding up a statue of the Mother Mary and baby Jesus Yeshua, and the baby is black and the mother is black. And then you see here in Africa, they're holding up a white image of the Christ. It's totally opposite lands, and both have different views of what the Christ looked like. So we need to thank America for lying to us, and we need to thank the pastors for not telling us the truth. Too many of us are asleep, and America does not want an informed and awake black race. America does not want every black in America to be all fed up at the same time. They want us to feel like everything's hunky-dory and everything's great. And America does not want all its African Americans to know that they are possibly also Hebrew Israelites and have the same claim to being Jewish as the European Jews do. And they do not, the Jews don't want the world to know that they are not the original Jews, and that the slaves taken from Africa over all these time and all these years are actually the real children of Israel. It's a picture of a 12th century 1100 AD Russian Orthodox depiction of the Christ. And as you can see here, this picture shows a black Christ. And this is 1100 AD. This is almost 900 years ago. So the question is, how are they showing pictures of a black Christ, and we have pictures of a white Christ. What is it that the Russians had of books or documents that led them to believe that the Christ was a black man? Did they just simply go off scriptures, or do they have historical accounts that they had records of that we don't have records of? So they were descendants of the free slaves who were not so easily tricked by the history racist tactics of the Europeans during the transatlantic slave trade. Somehow their forefathers were able to pass down the accurate history of who the slaves in America really were in regards to the Bible. These were the real commandment keepers. And as you can see, throughout slavery, that the real Jews in America struggled to maintain their heritage. A lot of their traditions became submerged into Christianity, but remained part of the old Negro spirituals. Some of the first Hebrew Israelite groups began forming in the southern states of America as early as around the 1880s. So around the 1880s, a lot of the black people were being awakened as to who are the real Israelites. And it's interesting to note this because 1880 is not too long ago, and a lot of us have grandparents or great-grandparents that can recall stories of how their relatives were once slaves, and they passed down, of course, stories and traditions and different things about what happened in the past. And I happened to run into a lady at a hospital who was almost 90 years old. And the lady said, she had her son there, and the lady said that when she was growing up, she was engaged to a man, and her fiance talked to her father, and her father told her fiance that he could marry her only if he did three things. And the three things he said was that the man, if they got married, that he would not lay hands on her or hit her. And then he said number two, that she could not eat pork. And so when he said that, I automatically assumed that he was Muslim or she was Muslim. And then he said the third thing was that she needed to observe the Sabbath. And so I asked her if she was a Israelite or Hebrew Israelite, and she said yes. And this lady was almost 90 years old. And she said that her father was a rabbi. She came from Texas and knew that the blacks in America were actually descendants of the Hebrew Israelites that were scattered into West Africa. And I asked her if her father knew this, and she was 90 years old, and her father must have been born in the late 1800s. And so then her father's father had to have been a slave, and she said yes. He said that her father's father knew this because it was orally passed down to him throughout the years. And she said that some of the slaves were able to retain and maintain this heritage. She says that during the time of slavery, many of the elders that tried to teach the heritage and the customs and maintain the language were separated from the rest of the slaves, and they were killed off. Said the younger slaves growing up didn't have a chance to keep their original tongue or to remember their original heritage and their customs and their history. But however, the slave masters weren't able to eliminate this totally completely, as there were some people that did carry on this heritage of who they were. And she also made note that during the slave trades that actually the slaves were actually speaking a dialect that was similar to Hebrew or Western Aramaic. And it's interesting because later in the volume series, you'll see how I compare the dialects of the Nigerian Igbos and some of the Nigerian Yoruba and the Bantus lands, and also some of the words that the slave masters will record that the slaves would say in their native tongue for different objects like dog, cat, baby, and cow. And because the slaves had their own native tongue in the 1700s and 1800s before they started to learn broken English. And the strikingly similar things about their languages, even the Nigerian Igbo languages and Bantu languages, is that many of these words line up 100% with what these words were pronounced in Western Aramaic or Hebrew. So if the pronunciation of the word cat in Western Aramaic was a certain word, then if the slaves were also pronouncing the word cat in the way it was pronounced in Western Aramaic, this will only mean that the slaves had always had this language. It is not something that they were taught by the European slave masters. It was not something that people taught them while they were in Africa. It was something that was passed down. And so the question is how are these slaves speaking in Western Aramaic when Western Aramaic was a language that was only spoken in Palestine and Judea and Israel, as Eastern Aramaic was spoken in Iraq and Iran and parts of Syria and Turkey. It's said that the Western Aramaic is not spoken anymore, but Eastern Aramaic is still spoken by some Chaldeans and some people living in the mountains in Syria. And then after a period of time that the Aramaic was replaced by the Arabic language. And so the proof about the Hebrew Israelites, the black Hebrew Israelites being from descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel is lining up with language, lining up with cultures and traditions, lining up with the Bible, lining up with DNA, lining up with using critical thinking, and lining up with historical accounts in terms of quotes, and also archaeological proof. So all these different factions of proof are way more than enough to prove that the so-called black man scattered all the way into the Americas and the Caribbeans has more right and more proof to hold fast and say that he is descendant of the ancient Hebrew Israelites than the people that are in Israel today, who are the European Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Middle Eastern and Spanish Portuguese Jews. And we see these, and like I said, this lady, she was a part of a Hebrew Pentecostal church, and her whole family stated that they had multiple churches throughout the United States of America that operated this way. They had some of them had church service just on Saturdays, as the Sabbath is the day that they keep it holy. And some of them have services on Saturday and Sunday for those that have not yet accepted or can let go of worshiping on Sunday from ancient Christian teaching. And this is real. So the whitenization of the Bible is real. They were hidden agendas for us back then to keep us from knowing this stuff, and it was hidden agendas for us today, even in modern day times. As we can see here, and this slide right here shows that Richard Nixon, one of our presidents in 1969, even though they brought us into slavery, even though they freed us, even though they segregated us, even though they kept us from reading and writing and having access to books, even after all that, in the 1960s, America still saw black people as the problem. Here, Richard Nixon says that the whole problem in America is really the blacks. And the key, he says, is to devise a system that recognizes this without appearing to. So do it on the low, in a sneaky way. And so the Holocaust that happened to so many different generations of people, races of people, Jews, the Native Americans, Japanese, massive death from the atomic bomb. And you will see that they all got reparations, like I talked about before, 100 million, 3 billion, 2 billion reparations monies going to these other race groups. But of course, slaves were not given any reparations. And that is really for a reason. It's for a clear reason, that because there's a clear agenda towards blacks to destroy blacks in America and to keep us at the bottom of society. And that all is an agenda that fits in with God's perfect plan and also what the curses of Israel talks about in Deuteronomy 28.